We serve a God who is in control. We serve a God who is sovereign, and everything is firmly and securely in his hands. So everything that you see in our world today isn't the result of things gone amok as far as it relates to the divine perspective. God has everything under control, and he's moving things according to his purposes so that they meet his ultimate ends. And we get a sense of that in the last section of Revelation chapter 17, which is our text today. This is a third part of our study of Revelation chapter 17, which is part of our larger study of the book of Revelation. We have some good things in store, and really, hopefully, I think that I hope that this episode really gives you great encouragement. I don't think we're going to be covering new ground here. I mean, we talk about the sovereignty of God and how God's in control. I mean, that's not something that's new. If you've been a Christian for a while, you say, yeah, we know that, we understand that. But isn't it true that every time we encounter that sort of teaching on the pages of Scripture, that we find ourselves greatly encouraged by it? And so that's what I think we're going to encounter as we look at Revelation chapter 17, verses 15 through 18. And so as we finish up this chapter, we're going to be seeing some great things as it relates to our God. And by the way, this is one of those areas where I've said before that in our study of Revelation, what I don't want for this study is for this to be something where our main and sole concern is just solving the puzzle and unlocking different mysteries and saying, I understand what this means and I don't understand what that means and that sort of thing. One thing that I've said before is that if we miss the wonder of our God and who he is in the course of this study, then I think that we're doing it wrong. And so this is a good opportunity, I think, to really center our hearts and our minds on who God is, even in a world like ours, and even in a world of what things are going to look like at the end, because that's really where this focus is going to be on. But even though this is looking at things in the future, this isn't to say that we're dealing with a different God in the present. Okay, so hopefully you'll understand what I'm talking about, what I'm getting at as once we delve into the text. So stay tuned. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, well, we are going to be finishing up Revelation chapter 17 on this episode, and we'll be making our way into chapter 18 next time. I anticipate that with chapter 18, we'll probably spend a couple of episodes on that. I don't foresee us spending more than a couple of weeks in that chapter, but then again, what do I know? Sometimes, a lot of times my plans change. So, but I mean, as it stands right now, I don't foresee us spending more than 2 weeks in chapter 18. So that's the immediate plan, just kind of going forward, just as it relates to that. Then we'll get into chapter 19. I'm thinking that once we finish chapter 19, then we'll probably, do another break, kind of take a deep breath before delving into chapter 20, which is going to be pretty involved, just as far as our discussion and interpretation of that passage. That's the famed Millennium passage, which a lot of people like to talk about, a lot of people like to speculate on, and that sort of thing. And so you can be assured that there's going to be a lot of discussion as it relates to that chapter. So I don't know how long we're going to spend in chapter 20. But we will. I think we'll be in there for a while. It's kind of along the same lines of a Revelation chapter 13. Just as far as, spending a lot of time in there. I think chapter 13 thus far was the chapter that we spent the longest time in out of all the other chapters we looked at up to this point. And Revelation chapter 20 might be along the same lines, but I'm not entirely sure. So that's kind of how things are going to look going forward. So, but for now, we're going to be finishing up chapter 17. Before we do that, though, what time it is. It is time for the shameless plug for my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return? and the events that point to it. Jesus' teaching on the Olivet Discourse. That's what the book is about. You can get it on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. And as usual, I will have, I'll have a link in the episode description so you can click on it. It'll take you right to the Amazon page and you can order a copy if you so choose. One other piece of business that I need to take care of. It's a very, very minor thing, but I do want to correct myself in any time that I find that I'm inaccurate about something. But you remember from last time when we were talking about how people historically look at the seven kings, as seven Roman emperors in history and who's what and everything like that, and how I said that there were some people who will skip over certain emperors, which is kind of a convenient thing to do to kind of get to the emperor that they think best matches the time in which John is writing and that sort of thing. And I said that I don't think that's a legitimate approach, because no matter how short or how long an emperor's tenure is, and that's the reason why some of these people would skip certain emperors, because they only ruled for a very short amount of time. I said no matter how short or how long they rule, they're still historically considered an emperor. And I used the example in our own history of William Henry Harrison and how he's numbered the 9th president of the United States, and and this is what I said. I said that he was president for a few months. I think I said 3 months after his inauguration. Actually, it's a lot shorter, actually. So it actually strengthens my case even more. But I do want to correct myself, is that he was in office for only 31 days after his inauguration. So it was actually just a month. So any history buffs out there who last week were heard me mention that, you might have picked up on that and said, well, it wasn't even that long. So it wasn't 3 months. It was really just a month. So that's even shorter and makes my case even more. So even with just being in office for a month before he died, we still consider him a president of the United States. We don't skip over him and say that, we don't have to count him as a president because, he was only in office for a month. So why would we do that with the emperors that historically are recognized as emperors? And that's the point that I was trying to make. So that's the correction that I want to make there. Now that I've done so, we can go ahead and move on to the more important things. And here's what I'm going to do again. I'm going to read the entire chapter again. So again, we can get into, we can have a full picture again of what we're dealing with in this chapter. So in Revelation chapter 17, starting in verse 1, it says, "Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk.' And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, 'Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to arise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an eighth It is an eighth, but it belongs to the seven, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their authority, their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For the Lord is for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. All right, now let me just pause there and say that's everything that we've covered over the last couple of episodes. So you see there, we've been talking about the great prostitute and the beast on whom the prostitute rides. A couple of weeks ago, we spent most of our focus on the prostitute in verses 1 through 7, and then as the angel is giving more insight to what John is seeing, he describes the beast and what the 7 heads and the 10 horns represent and everything like that. So our focus on the last episode was on the beast. Now, this episode, we're going to bring the prostitute and the beast together and see what happens specifically with the prostitute, because that's what's going to happen here. And remember, so the prostitute is coming back on the scene in this last section here in chapter 17. We're going to read the last 4 verses here in a second. But I want you to remember, I want you to recall to mind, why the angel is going into this detail here with John. Because remember, and we just read it here just a minute ago, John's marveling at the prostitute, because she's dressed in luxury and that sort of thing. And there's a great marvel about her appearance. And the angel says, "Why do you marvel? I'm going to show you, everything having to do with this woman and the beast that carries her." And then in starting the explanation, it's interesting that the angel turns John's attention to the beast and describes the beast and what he's all about. Or I guess I rather should say it, regarding the beast. And so, which reminds us again of how the prostitute, the woman, and the beast are together. Remember, the woman herself is drunk on the blood of the saints, and that's very much in connection to her riding the beast. So we're outwardly the woman may look astonishing, but we're dealing with a bad character here. And the fact that she rides the beast and that she's drinking the blood she's drunk on the blood of the saints should tell us as much. But even so, the whole thing of, with the angel saying, "Hey, why are you marveling at this?" Right? I will, where he says, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. And then with what we're going to see in this passage, it's almost as if it's saying, look, the woman, everything with the woman, with this prostitute, it is not as it seems. She looks beautiful in her luxury and her gold and her jewels and everything like that, but her end is not anything that that's going to be impressive. I mean, she herself, her impressiveness isn't going to stand, because she herself is going to fall and she's going to be destroyed. And it's interesting because it's going to come at the hands of the beast. And so with that said, let's look at what happens here with the woman. And so here we pick up in verse 15. So let me read the rest of the chapter here, where it says, "And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." So there we see that, the prostitute's end is no good. So even though she looks beautiful now, even though she looks, outstanding, as everything is described with her, that impressiveness can only go so far. And again, we have to remind ourselves, and John had to be reminded that, hey, remember, she is a woman that is riding the beast. And we've been exposed to the beast and what he's all about in Revelation chapter 13. And being revisited now with this image of the beast, we're given a little bit more insight, specifically as it relates to the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And what I'll just say, just as a brief review, remember what we saw with the 7 heads, which are 7 hills, and they're also 7 kings. We're not talking about specific kings that have existed in the first century and things like that, and explain why in the previous episode. But again, remembering that 7 is symbolic in Revelation, it is having to do with completeness. What we're seeing there with the 7 kings is governmental power throughout history, and I would say between the first and second comings of Christ, especially. And with that, what we're seeing is a span of time that leads up to the completion that comes to that 7th king, which is going to be a 7th king that's going to come into existence and be destroyed, at the end when Christ comes back. And again, I'm not talking about a specific king, but I mean, again, if we're looking at this from a symbolic perspective, coming up to that 7th king, all that really means is that it's coming to its full completion, where governmental power is going to rise up again, and it's going to be short-lived. The beast as an 8th king, that's part of the 7, but he's going to go to destruction. Or I keep saying he, but I should say it, because the beast isn't a he, it's an it that represents everything having to do with, anti-God, anti-Christ, and anti-God's people, that sort of thing. But the clue that you get when the end comes is that it's going to, at least with the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit, the 7th king the 7th king is going to be around only for a little while. That sort of language clues us in on the fact that this is going to happen at the end. And I drew from clues that we had from Revelation chapter 20 to make that determination. And just the outright declaration that the beast is going to rise out of the bottomless pit and go to destruction gives us an understanding of, when we work our way to that 7th king, we're talking about the end there. So the 7 heads represent the 7 hills and the 7 kings, and it represents a span of time, okay, leading up to the end. The 10 horns, as we talked about, and as we saw, as we drew from, represent a particular point in time. And not a span of time. So, and again, we saw this because it says it's, these are 10 kings which haven't received royal power yet, and that's, if we're talking about the current time in John's time, and even in our time, we're working up to that point that where it's going to lead up to the final end. So until that end comes, these 10 kings, quote unquote, so to speak, again, we're looking at this symbolically, aren't in existence yet, but they will. And when they do, they're going to give their royal power to the beast. And it's these 10 kings, which are going to make war against the Lamb, and the Lamb is going to conquer them. That's what happens at the end. And we see the same sort of setup in places like chapter 16, chapter 19, and chapter 20. Okay. Chapter 16, we've already explored. Chapter 19, we're going to look at later, obviously, as well as chapter 20. So hopefully when we get into chapter 19 and chapter 20, you're going to see how all of the pieces of this puzzle just kind of fit together, okay? And hopefully things will kind of fall into place. That's my hope. And so, by the way, as long as we're looking at things from a symbolic point of view, I don't think I mentioned this last time, but again, you think about 10 horns, 10 also being a complete number symbolically. I think a word that's best used to fit that would be totality, which, if we're equating these to the kings of the whole world in chapter 16, that makes a lot of sense, because we're dealing with the kings of the whole world who gather to make war against the Lord. Horns speak of strength and power. So if we're talking about kings that are symbolized as horns, we're talking about very powerful, strong kings that span over the whole world. Okay, and so that's what we're talking about with those 10 horns. Now, the 10 horns are really what's in view in these last four verses here. And so, really, what we see here is, let's take a look here. Let's just start to dive into the passage here, because we have, as we pick up in verse 15, this is the angel that's been talking to John, continues his explanation. And he says, and the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. All right. So if you remember at the beginning of chapter 17, the angel had, said to John, he said, come and I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters. And we pointed forward to this verse here, verse 15, to show you what the waters represent, the many waters represent. We're told here the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. Okay. And we also made connection to that in the sense that, since she's connected with luxury and riches and materialism, all the kings of the earth go into her, as well as the dwellers of the earth and everything like that. There's that allure, there's that draw. And a lot of the luxury and her being identified as Babylon the Great can be connected to this whole thing of, Babylon, being seated on many waters. We saw that there was similar language to that in description of Babylon in Jeremiah chapter 51, which points to Babylon's commerce and industry and that sort of thing, and having access, through the waterways to many nations and languages and peoples and kings to carry out business and everything like that. Not saying that what we're seeing here in chapter 17 is a revived Babylon. Babylon is fallen, is going to stay fallen. But again, it draws our attention to what we already know of, or what we should know of from the Old Testament. And how, the Babylon the Great, which again is connected to the great city, is anything that's associated with, people that are, nations that are against the people of God. That's what you think of when you think of Babylon, and that sort of thing. And we've reviewed this over and over again. I don't think we need to go into another review of that again now. But again, just to understand what we're talking about here. And again, one other thing that I said, and I think it bears repeating, is that we're not saying that riches or materials or that sort of thing in and of themselves are bad. But the thing with the prostitute is that she uses her allure and the luxury to draw people in pursuit of those things, and leaving, or, drawing people, if we're talking about true believers, trying to draw them away from the one true God, or as it relates to the dwellers of the earth who are unbelievers, keeping their minds off of the one true God. And a lot of times the lure of riches and materialism and that sort of thing was connected to false religions and things like that. So you kind of see the devious activity of the prostitute as it relates to all of this. So the prostitute is a wicked figure in this whole thing with chapter 17. Okay, now don't forget that the prostitute is riding the beast. And as we said here, as it says here in verse 15, it says, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. But again, in the way that she's seated on the many waters, it's via the beast, and the beast is the one that carries her. And that's no wonder, because in chapter 13, remember what we saw as it relates to the beast there. In verse, let's see, chapter 13, verse, in the middle of verse 7, and authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. Okay, so this isn't anything that's happening independent of the beast. Okay, which again reminds us of the devious, diabolical nature of everything that's going on here. And so really think about this for a second, though, because this really shows us the massive and extensive influence the prostitute has all over the place. One of the things that I mentioned before, if you remember, is that this doesn't necessarily have to only apply to nations that are rich or who are rich or continuing to pursue riches and materialism and that sort of thing. That's not necessarily true. I mean, even if you have impoverished countries, I mean, even there, Christians in those nations have to be very careful about the lure of materialism, because you would think that those people would be ones that would be especially susceptible to the lure of the prostitute, or at least the temptation would be strong in very much strong in those cases. So this is something, whether you're talking whatever nation or language or country you're talking about, this is something where we're seeing where the prostitute, who again is riding on the beast, it's being carried by the beast, has great influence. And again, if you just go back to the beginning of chapter 17, you see as much. We just read it a few moments ago. With whom, verse 2, the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And remember, we're talking about the whole thing of them being drunk. We're talking about excess here. So this isn't anything that's spotty or anything like that. This is something where the influence of the prostitute is something that is far and wide, far reaching to all these tribes and nations and peoples and languages and that sort of thing. Okay. And so that's what we're told here. The waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. Now, here's where the misfortune starts to happen with the woman, with the prostitute. Because it says in verse 16, it says, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. Now think about that for a second. And especially when we're thinking about this in light of the beast and who it is or what it is, and everything that we've talked about as far as the beast in chapter 13, and even what we're seeing here, we think about the beast and we think about the entity that opposes the people of God, and even as it says in chapter 13. Opposes and goes to war with the saints and conquers them. You get a sense and you get an understanding that by the activity of the beast, it's pretty evident by what it does, that it does not like the saints of God, right? I.e., it hates the saints. It lives in hatred of the saints, of the people of God. And that's expressed and manifests in its oppression of God's people, right? And we've seen that. So imagine, though, when you have this woman, this harlot, who rides the beast along with these 10 kings, which again, we're not talking about literal 10 kings that you number off and you're given names like at the end times. This is symbolic of total governmental rule and strong governmental rule and that sort of thing. Just in the symbolism of the number 10 and of the symbol of the horns, right? The beast along with these 10 horns, they hate the prostitute. Now, what is it that causes them to hate the prostitute? For what reason? What's going on behind the scenes or in front of the scenes that causes this reversal? Because remember, it seems like that everything and everybody is working in tandem, hand in hand. I think the one thing that everybody in this picture, in this symbolic picture, has in common is that they hate God and they hate God's people. But now they hate the prostitute. What's going on here? My answer to that question is simple. I don't know. Except for the fact that God is the one who's working everything here according to his purposes and according to his own ends. We read that later on in the passage. But the specifics behind it, we don't know. We don't know what the specifics are, and I think that that's okay. Not to mention the fact that we see similar things here, and I'm going to show you here in a couple of minutes here. God working in similar ways with actual nations and actual armies who turn against each other. And we wonder what the situation, why it happened the way that it did, and we don't know. Okay, but I'll get to that a little bit later. But understand that though that we have this reversal here. Okay, which by the way should show you that there is, and this isn't anything new, but there is no security that you see in the beast. Okay. This is another one of those reasons why, why you just based on what we've been exposed to as it relates to the beast, that you shouldn't put your hope in the beast. You shouldn't receive its mark. People receive its mark, and that mark does nothing for them in protecting them from the wrath of God, right? On a similar level, if people are hitching their wagon to the prostitute who rides the beast, there's no security in that. The beast is one who's going to turn, and along with the 10 kings, is going to turn on the prostitute and destroy her. And in fact, actually, let's read that there. As it says there in verse 16, it says, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. Now, what does it go on to say? It says, they will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. So, I mean, in case you had any doubt, as far as, the destruction of the prostitute, of this woman, there you see the description right there. Now, of course, again, the description there isn't literal, but actually what you have going on there in verse 16, again, if you're in the first century and you're hearing this read to you, and if you have an understanding of the Old Testament, which I think most people in the first century did, at least on a lot grander, higher level than people do here today in the 21st century. But if you have an understanding of the Old Testament and you're hearing this for the first time in that first century, you understand, that this is drawing from a description that's laid out in Old Testament and in Old Testament scripture as well. Specifically in Ezekiel chapter 16, and I'm going to read just part of this for you here. Ezekiel 16 is a long chapter anyway, and it's very interesting. The subtitle of chapter 16, and the subtitles and everything are not inspired, but it's just interesting. The title that it's given here, it says, "The Lord's Faithless Bride." I just think that that's interesting, just given what we saw a couple of episodes ago. Comparing the prostitute with the bride of Christ, which is the church. And here, just in the language that's drawn from this passage, we're talking about a faithless bride, which, really, because of her harlotry and of her whoring, that's kind of the language that's used in this chapter. Now, again, this is a long chapter, and I'm not gonna read the whole chapter. It's 63 verses long, but I do want to take a particular handful of verses here that kind of centers more on, where the angel and therefore John is drawing from in this description of what happens to the prostitute. Now, contextually, as it relates to what you see in Ezekiel, what you see there is God's judgment on Israel, who is faithless to God because of her whorings. And the whorings, is having to do with going after the gods of other nations and that sort of thing. That's what we're talking about here. And so there's a pronouncement of judgment against the people of God in this particular prophecy here. So again, I'm in Ezekiel chapter 16. I'm going to read verses 35 through 41. Listen to what it says here. It says, "Therefore, O prostitute," there you go, right there. "Therefore, O prostitute, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, because your lust was poured out, and your nakedness uncovered in your whorings with your lovers and with all your abominable idols, and because of the blood of your children that you gave to them." See, there's a lot of similarities here in just with the language that's used here. Again, this is all used what we saw in chapter 17 to draw our minds to what's laid out here in Ezekiel. I'm sorry, I shouldn't interrupt myself as much as I do when reading through this. Your nakedness is uncovered in your whorings and your lovers, and with all your abominable idols, and because of the blood of your children that you gave to them. Therefore, behold, I will gather all your lovers with whom you took pleasure, all those you loved and all those you hated. I will gather them against you from every side, and will uncover your nakedness to them, that they may see all your nakedness. And I will judge you as a woman who commits as women who commit adultery and shed blood are judged, and bring upon you the blood of wrath and jealousy. And I will give you into their hands, and they shall throw down your vaulted chamber and break down your lofty places. They shall strip you of your clothes and take your beautiful jewels and leave you naked and bare. They shall bring up a crowd against you, and they shall stone you and cut you to pieces with their swords. And they shall burn your houses and execute judgments upon you in the sight of many women. I will make you stop playing the whore, and you shall also give payment no more. Okay, so there you kind of see the similar language here, and even there in that last verse that I read there in verse 41, and they shall burn your houses and execute judgment and that sort of thing. Remember, the prostitute is one in chapter 17 of Revelation who's burned with fire. I mean, all those sorts of things. So you see all of that going on. And remember, a lot of these are nations that, as it says there in Ezekiel 16, are ones that Israel loved. But God is one who's going to bring those nations up against Israel. So they're going to turn against Israel and go after her and kill her and destroy her. God is going to use them as his instruments of judgment against his people because of their harlotry and of their whorings. Now, again, let's be clear here. We're not to draw an exact one-for-one comparison in the sense that we're not dealing with here in Revelation chapter 17 a situation where the prostitute, because here's the thing, some people will equate the prostitute to an apostate church, the apostate church of the end times. Now, I don't think that sort of thing is what we're talking about here, especially when we're given the picture of the prostitute who is drunk on the blood of the saints. Okay, the prostitute is against the true, authentic saints. We're not talking about any sort of, I hope you understand what I'm saying when we're talking about that there. So, but even in Ezekiel 16, we see a hint of vengeance of the blood of the children that has been given to them and that sort of thing. So there has been death involved, death of the innocent. And in the same way, when we're talking about the church and the blood of the saints, I think we're very much aware that I think part of what goes into that, this judgment on the prostitute is her being drunk on the blood of the saints. But overall, what we're seeing here, I hope you see the similarities there. And so basically, by drawing from this Old Testament, the wording here that we're very familiar with, or that we should be familiar with, from Ezekiel chapter 16. We get an idea of just how complete and how dire this destruction is going to be. Well, in a certain sense, how complete and dire. I mean, with Israel would be raised back up again, obviously, but with the prostitute, it's not. And you get that much of a sense even when you read further in Revelation into chapter 18, which we're going to start to look at next time. Okay, but do you see now? I mean, if you're standing in John's sandals, and remember, John is one who's been looking at this woman and marveling, and the angel is, essentially saying, "Oh, whoa, hold on. Why are you marveling at this? Let me let you in on a thing or two as it relates to this prostitute. And things are not as they seem, and you don't want to hitch your wagon to her, because there's no security in there anyway." And we see that just by the fact that the beast and the 10 horns turn against the prostitute, and they hate the prostitute for whatever reason, and they go against her, and they exercise this complete and utter destruction. Okay. Now, the fact that the 10 horns are the ones that are, along with the beast, do this, makes us aware that this is an end times event here. Okay, because remember, with the 7 heads, we're looking at a period of time, a span of time, history leading up to the second coming of Christ. With the 10 horns, we're dealing with a particular moment in time, and that particular time having to do with the end, right before Christ comes back. And again, we get that clue in verse 14, where it says that that they and the beast are going to make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb is going to conquer them. Okay, so that's what we see here. So we see utter destruction of the prostitute. Okay. In verse 17, it says, for here's really, we get into the whole thing I talked about at the beginning, the whole thing about the sovereignty of God in everything and how these things unfold. It says, for God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So basically, in that one verse, we're talking about God is the one who's orchestrating everything here. These things having to do with the prostitute and the beast and, whatever, even with anything else that you see here, are things that don't happen independent of God himself. Okay. We need to understand that. And listen, even in visions that we've seen in the book of Revelation that span between the first and second comings of Christ, we see God's sovereignty at work and at play here. And I've done the best that I can to point out where those are in our study as we've been going through these texts. So, and I want to remind you of that just so you understand and just so you're aware that we're not just seeing the, God's sovereignty at play at the very end. Just to give you an example, we'll go back to I think it may have been the very first ones that we pointed out as it related to all of this in chapter 6, specifically when it talks about the soul of the martyrs and the souls of the martyrs saying how long before our blood is avenged and we're vindicated, essentially. I mean, that's just a paraphrase. And they were told to wait a little bit longer until the number of their brothers who are to be martyred are completed, which gives us this understanding of that even the number of martyrs is something that's in the plan of God. And it's something that's orchestrated by God himself. Even the number, it says it has to reach this number, and that's according to God's plan. What number that is, we don't know, and we don't have to know. But there you see how God is sovereignly in control of all of this. And even with the martyrs, it's, even with the martyrdom of God's people, that's not anything that happens outside of the will of God. Which, I mean, even with martyrs anyway, I mean, you might think, well, that's kind of mean of God, isn't it? Well, if you're looking at this from a purely Christian perspective, it shouldn't be. Absent from the body is present with the Lord, right? Do not be afraid of those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Even when you die, you're with the Lord in heaven. I don't think that's not an unsatisfactory trade, if it's according to God's purposes and everything. Now, I'm not saying that, since it's better to be with the Lord to go kill yourself or anything like that. Obviously, that's that, but if we're talking about everything in God's control, okay, even the death of his saints, of his servants, his martyrs, even that is to his glory and is not ultimately for our bad because we're in the presence of the Lord when that happens. But all of this to say is that we've come upon the sovereignty of God in the book of Revelation before, even in past texts, as it relates to things having to do with the span between Christ's first and second coming. And here, when we're more concentrated on things in the end, you still see that taking place until God's purposes are served, right? So again, it says, for God has put it into their hearts. God is the one who's done this, who's put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose. Okay. Now, trust me, that's not anything that these other nations and people who are enemies of God know is happening to them. According to them, they're working on their own will, their own volition, and that sort of thing. And unbeknownst to them, are actually carrying out God's plan. And listen, that shouldn't surprise us. We see those sorts of happenings even in the Old Testament. I mean, you even think about Pharaoh, how God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and even at that final ultimate hardening, in that hardening, Pharaoh says, after they let the Israelites go, they said, "Oh my goodness, what have we done?" And so, from the perspective of Pharaoh and all of his army and the charioteers and everything, their whole thing is like, we need to get them back. And it's a decision and it's movements and everything that they themselves are making. But as scripture says, God is the one who hardened their hearts, and which would lead them to go after the Israelites and ultimately get drowned in the Red Sea. So they're going according to God's purposes, but unbeknownst to them, they're just saying, "Hey, what did we do? We need to get those Israelites back," and so forth and so on. You even think about how God enlisted the help. Well, not the help. I shouldn't say help. Nations don't help out God, but enlisted the use of pagan armies to go against the people of Israel when God brings judgment on Israel for disobedience and for breaking covenant and that sort of thing. Those other nations aren't approached by God and saying, "Okay, this is what I want you to do. My people have disobeyed me, and so what I need you to do is I need you to go and attack them." That's not how it happened. These nations, in their mind, in an independent sort of way, by their own decision and their own volition, they're saying, "Hey, let's go attack them. Let's go take their spoil," whatever might be going through their minds. God is the furthest thing. The God of the Bible, Yahweh, is the furthest thing from their minds, and they go and they attack God's people. They don't know and they don't understand that they are being used by God to go against his people and bring judgment against them. God put it in their hearts to be able to do those very things. Okay. Now that's examples of, just even that last example. Whoops, I almost dropped my Bible there. That last example of, what God does in bringing judgment against his people when they were disobedient and they broke the covenant and that sort of thing. But again, just even with what we're considering here in chapter 17, we're dealing with what we thought to be like-minded figures here in the form of the prostitute and the beast, and also the 10 horns who are of like mind. And then the 10 horns and the beast turn against the woman and destroy her. They destroy the prostitute. Again, what is the reason for that specifically? We don't know, but we know just based on this passage here that God is behind it. And it's part of his purposes, and this is something that's used to carry out his purposes. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose. Now, again, like I said, we've seen this with actual real nations before, where people who are up against the people of God, and who show aggressiveness towards the people of God, end up turning on each other, right? I think it's I've turned back here to Judges chapter 7. I think this is where it is. I just read this not too long ago in my own personal time, and I'm struggling to remember if it was in chapter 7 that I saw this, but if you're familiar with the story, okay, yeah, I found it here. When Gideon is going to be going up against the Midianites, and remember, God shaved down the army of Israel to 300, against a horde of people. I mean, the text there says that, the number of people of Midianites was as many as the sand on the sea. Which was a biblical phrase in the Bible, which is to explain is a massive number of people. So imagine 300 Israelites in the army against this massive army. Now these 300, we get the sense as you read further into the story of Gideon, because this is the central character here. The judge at the time is Gideon. That the 300 were more in line with chasing after those who fled from Israel at this initial encounter. But at the initial encounter, with things having to do with Israel against the Midianites, notice what happened. Chapter 7, verse 21, every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Bethshida toward Zerera, as far as the border of Abel Meholah, by Tabith. So there you see, you notice, but the main emphasis there that I want you to draw from in that passage is where it says, where it says the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. Okay. Now, what exactly was going through the army's mind that would cause them to turn against one another? I don't know. I don't know what God specifically did to make them do that. I always just know that God did this. in whatever way that he did, he made them turn on each other and they started slaying one another. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, as it relates to war with the Philistines, in chapter 14 of 1 Samuel, verse 15, and there was panic in the camp, and it's talking about the camp of the Israelites, in the field and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. Okay, and so when you read, I think I might have. Did I pass by that where it says there? There's a spot in here, and I apologize for not being as prepared here. But I mean, if you read 1 Samuel chapter 14, you see where it talks about how the Philistines you turn on each other. So again, we're dealing with the enemies of Israel, and how God works on Israel's behalf. I mean, mainly, I guess you can mainly say on Jonathan's behalf, because Jonathan is the one who's kind of, unbeknownst to his father, is kind of leading this whole thing, and how the Philistines eventually turn on each other. Okay, I found it here. It's further down in verse 20. It says, "Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine sword was against his fellow, and there was great great confusion." Okay, so there you see and you wonder why did that happen? I mean, I don't know, but it's something that you get the sense, and you get the impression that God is the one who did something along those lines. Another example, and we don't have to read this, but I'll just make you aware of it in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Actually, several weeks ago, if you remember, I shared a sermon with you that I did on this podcast, where I preached from 2 Chronicles chapter 20, having to do with Jehoshaphat and Israel being attacked by three armies, and how God delivered them. I mean, the topic that I was preaching on was faith in the midst of crisis. But one of the things that I pointed out is how God came and fought for Israel by turning the armies on each other. So you had two armies that went against one, and then once that was destroyed, then they turned against those two armies that attacked the other one, then turned on each other. And people recognize and they acknowledge that God is the one who did that. Now, why did they turn against each other and what happened in all of that? I don't know, but we do know from the text that God is the one who did that. God is the one who did that. So again, you see here, in a very same way. No, the difference, there's a little bit of a difference, because we're not dealing with literal armies here in Revelation chapter 17, but we're seeing a concept that we're familiar with as it relates to, how God has dealt with coming to his people's aid in the Old Testament by turning people who are enemies of Israel, having them turn against each other. In the very same way, we see that with the beast and the prostitute. Okay. And all of this, as it says, for God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose. Carry out his purpose. Now, God always has a purpose. And even in the here and now, when we look at things around the world, we might not know specifically what that purpose is. But if we understand that things don't happen independent of his purposes, that should give us a little bit of a comfort in the sense that, God is still ruling, and he reigns, and he sits on the throne, and that he's in control, so that nothing is outside of his grip, outside of his grasp. In times when the world is on fire, and listen, we've been warned about that, and just some of the ways that's going to look, just as Jesus described how things would be in the Olivet Discourse, which, by the way, if you want to know how that relates to things today, not in specifics, in specific news headlines or anything like that, but in a general sense, I explained that in my book. So here's a second shameless plug for my book, Signs of the End. Go ahead and order yourself a copy. But even there, you get a sense that God is in control, and God has told us these things ahead of time. Okay. Now, here, just in the here and now, just looking at how things are unfolding, let us always have in our minds this whole thing that God is in control, and that even unbeknownst to them, there are many, peoples and kings and presidents and senates and nations and everything that might look like crazy and out of control. But we have to understand that God has a purpose, and whether he's directly by his own hand directing things, or in an indirect way by removing his hand so that certain other things according to his purpose can happen, who knows? But we don't know the end from the beginning. And when we see things up close and personal, we don't know specifically what God's purpose is for this particular time and for these particular events A, B, C, or D. But we do know that God has a purpose. And he always has a purpose, and it's all going to be leading up to that final time when Christ comes back. So even in that time when we're close to the end, we see that God has a purpose. And part of that purpose, and when we see God's judgment, it's going to involve, to a certain degree, God using his enemies to turn against other aspects of his enemy. And that's what we see here with the destruction of the prostitute. So he says he put in their minds, put in their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast. So again, that's something that we saw last time, and it was specifically in verse 13 regarding the 10 horns. They are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. That's all according to God's plan. It's going all according to God's purpose, so that his purposes can unfold the way that he preordained them, the way that he's laid them out. Again, the people, the actors, the figures that are involved in this will have no clue that they're going according to God's purposes. But God is the one who's in control of all of it. Okay? And so he's behind the whole thing of one mind. So these political governmental powers are going to give over their royal authority to the beast, which again, the beast is not an individual, but again, it's those philosophies, it's those beliefs, it's those actions, whatever those things are that stand against God and against the people of God. Now, even though these are against the people of God, they are still under his sway, under the sway of God. And so it's from that foundation represented by the beast that these 10 kings are going to operate. And they're going to do so in tandem and with one mind. And they're going to agree, and they're going to plug themselves in and build themselves up on that foundation. And it's all going to be according to God's purposes here. God using evil to work its way out for its ultimate good at the end. And notice what it says here: until the words of God are fulfilled. Nothing that God has set out to do is going to be left unfulfilled. It's not like God sets things in motion or works his hand to do things according to his purposes, but there's a chance that there's a snag that's going to be hit, or something's going to happen where there's an unforeseen interruption of things that's going to happen. No, this is all going to take place, and it's going to take place until the words of God are fulfilled. Notice the certainty there. God's words are going to be fulfilled. Now, what words specifically are we talking about here? I think that the words that we're talking about specifically, and particularly as it relates to the context of everything that we're talking about, has to do with things with the end and things leading up to the end where God's enemies are ultimately going to be destroyed. We start out with the prostitute, which we're seeing in this particular vision here. Now, what we're going to see, and what we've seen some semblances of even in chapter 16, is that there's going to be destruction of all of God's enemies, and we're going to see the destruction of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet in chapters to come. But that's what we're being led in on. That's what we're being shown. And even if those particular characters haven't shown up in the other particular visions of the end that we've looked at up to this point, God's fulfillment is for the defeat of evil, the defeat of his enemies, and the full and final supremacy of Christ after all sin and wickedness and everything is done away with. That's ultimately what we're dealing with there. So these things that God sets in place near the end are going to be in effect until God's words are fulfilled, which shows us that the ending of wickedness, the destruction of evil, in all of those things is a biblical certainty. So even with everything that we see in the wickedness that we're just inundated with, in our world around us. That is a temporary thing. And it's a sure thing. I mean, even when it comes up to the very end, the things that we see here in Revelation that it's going to unfold at the end, and we're going to get a little bit more. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in chapter 18 next time, because that's what chapter 18 goes into. But you see even with the prostitute what that looks like and everything, and how that all relates to God's purposes in the end, and how those things are going to be fulfilled. It is a certainty. And then in verse 18, it says, "And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." Now, we talked about the great city before, how it is connected to the woman who is identified as Babylon the Great, and how Babylon the Great is connected to the great city in other portions of Revelation scripture that we've seen. We don't need to re-examine that. We don't need to go over that again. We've gone over that a few times already. Hopefully that's been anchored in your minds, right? And when we're talking about the great city, we're talking about anything that, again, just in a similar way as the beast, anything that is against God, against Christ, against his people, and against his program, okay? Again, that's what we've been exploring, and that's what we've been seeing with the great city, with Babylon the Great, and everything like that, in past passages leading up to this point here. Now, as it relates to the great city, again, what it says is that the woman that you saw is. So we're back to present tense now. And it's saying that this is the woman that you saw is the great city and has right now, I guess you could put in brackets, dominion over the kings of the earth. Here's the thing, though. I believe that verse 18 is speaking, we've gotten a view of what's going to happen to her in the future, the woman in the future. Verse 18 brings us back to the present and says, this is who she is. She is the great city who has currently right now dominion over the kings on the earth, which again takes us back to the description that we saw in verse 2 of this same chapter, right? So what we see here is that even though the woman is described as someone who has dominion over the kings of the earth, that is not a firm dominion. And what I mean by that is because as we've seen, there's a coup that happens where the prostitute, this woman, is overturned. Remember, the 10 horns, based on what we saw in the last passage, is equated to the kings of the whole world in chapter 16. So the kings of the whole world, the kings of the earth, however way you want to describe it, are the 10 horns. We talked about that last time, and I explained why I believe that's the case. So we're talking about a woman who now has dominion over the kings of the earth, but there will come a time when the kings of the earth will turn against her along with the beast. So we see that her dominion isn't secure. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is another reason why you stay away from her. This is another reason why, you can't be lured in by her, because she's not secure. Number one, again, as we said before, because of her association with the beast. But number two, we see that her dominion is flimsy, because those who she has dominion over will turn against her and put her down and destroy her. Now, as we get into chapter 18, one of the things that we see in chapter 18, I think, the way that things unfold, I think we see from the kings of the earth, there's, maybe a sense of regret on their part after everything has happened as it has. We won't go into detail about that now. We'll talk about that later when we get to that point in chapter 18. But you see what I'm talking about, though. The woman's authority, her dominion is not secure. And so when the prostitute goes down, when this woman goes down, you have the kings of the earth that are left. Now, are they top king? Are they top dog? No, absolutely not. Because as we saw before, the 10 horns are the 10 kings that are going to make war against the Lamb, and the Lamb is going to conquer them, right? And remember what it said at the tail end of that? It said in verse 14, let me read verse 14 again. It says, they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. Why? For he is Lord of lords and King of kings. Okay. So here we're dealing with flimsy dominion all over the place, except when it comes to Jesus Christ himself. And so these 10 kings, the 10 horns, they go against that which was that had dominion over them, and they overtake her and they destroy her, then they try and do the same thing with the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It ain't happening. And it shows you who truly is in charge. So there again, we see in a very magnified way that we are in Jesus Christ dealing with somebody who is sovereign, and he rules and he's in control. And he's sovereign with everything that we've seen, with him putting into the minds of the beast and the 10 horns to do this and that. That again should call us to reminder of the things that we talked about before. We talked a little bit about the sovereignty of God before. The book of life, names that have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. It's the fact that it's from the foundation of the world speaks of his sovereignty, speaks of his control, how he is laying out the script and how he's unfolding the script according to his will and according to his purposes. Okay. So we see all of that laid out here in chapter 17. And so I hope this gives you, ladies and gentlemen, some comfort. And again, the magnifying glass right here of what we're looking at is on the end. But keep in mind, remember, we've been seeing this sort of thing all throughout Scripture in the book of Revelation, when we've had the description of things happening between the first and second comings of Christ. And if you are in him, if you are in Christ, your name is written in the Lamb's book of life. You are secure in him. Doesn't mean that everything in this world is going to be comfortable for you and me. It's not. But it does mean that anything that happens, it's according to his purposes. God's purposes are always good. They're always just. They're always perfect. And his sovereignty and his rule is not going to be overturned. The woman had dominion that was, sovereignly given to her, dominion over the kings of the earth. The kings of the earth, in the form of the 10 horns, overtook her and destroyed her. Those 10 kings are going to try and do the same thing to the Lamb of God. The Lamb of God is going to squash them, and he's going to do it very swiftly and decisively. That shows you who's truly in charge. And so even when it comes to the end, we know that victory is secured in him. We have the victory. And so again, this all comes back, by the way, to what we've talked about before as far as it relates to the theme that we should be seeing over and over again in the book of Revelation. And that is that Jesus Christ wins. And if you are in him, you are on the winning side. And therefore you have nothing to worry about. You have nothing to fear. Okay. And so we're going to get much more of this blessedness as we continue to unfold these final chapters in the book of Revelation. Now, in chapter 18, we're going to go into, the whole thing of the harlot's destruction and how the people of the world react to that, because they're going to get a good sense of what this is going to look like, and it's going to devastate them. Okay, and we're going to see the flimsy foundation that the people of the world, the dwellers of the earth, the flimsy foundation that they've anchored themselves onto, and how swiftly God has dealt with the prostitute through the instrument of the beast and the 10 horns and everything like that. But God's doing of this is pretty swift, and it's pretty frightening looking to the people of the earth. But we are not of that number that we should be fearful of what they should be, that what they fear and what they're trembling about. Okay. So when we come back next time, we're going to look at chapter 18. We're going to begin to see how all of this is perceived. Okay. And that ultimately is going to lead us into chapter 19, which will further lead us into a vision that's going to show us the ending of the beast and the false prophet. Okay. So that's a little bit of a forecast of what's coming up in the future. But for now, we're going to leave it there. So we've finished chapter 17. Okay, and we'll be ready for chapter 18 next time. Now, if you enjoyed this program and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Spotify. And also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And don't forget to buy a copy of my book, Signs at the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. I will leave a link in the episode description. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this analysis. I hope it's clearer to you kind of what we're dealing with, just as we've talked about this today and in the last couple of weeks. You can be sure to, if you need to listen to those previous 2 episodes along with this one as well, to get to, again, kind of get the full analysis there. But hopefully it's brought some clarity to you of what we're dealing with and what we're up for in the chapters to follow. Okay. Well, my name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.